Hey, Danny, how are you? I loved that piece you wrote about that. And actually, I didn't see it from your webpage. Somebody else shared it, which I loved. Hey, folks, Maui. Oh, man, it is so cold here in Maine. You should turn off your laptop and go sit in the sun for me. Virginia, Nebraska. Oh, one of my favorite states. Baton Rouge. Hey, Nancy. Olympia, Washington, St. Louis, Missouri, North Carolina, our friends in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Lebanon, New Hampshire. Um, I'm trying to see if we have more questions today. So let me start today with something that may or may not be useful to you. As I've been writing over the last several weeks, people respond to what I've written by talking about how frightening they find it or how depressed they feel they are after they read what I write. And I want to explain to you what I'm doing. I don't like not knowing things. For me, not knowing what's happening is really frightening. And so I write what I write at night to understand what's happening, to make sure that in my mind I get it. And I don't really, once I get it, I feel good. So I'm not really aware of how other people might read that. So just so you know, I'm not trying to frighten anybody, and there's no reason you can't let stuff wait until the next day. You don't have to read the stuff I write before bed. But it's definitely got an edge these days. And if you can think about it like I do, like, okay, now I understand, maybe that will help. Or simply wait, because there's no point in being unable to sleep because of something I've written. And I hate the idea that I'm keeping people up at night. So that's what I'm doing, and that's what I'm trying to do. All right, so let me get right into to a number of things. And I'm going to start where I've started before, and that is that there is an awful lot of vagueness and opaqueness about what's happening at our national government. And that makes it very hard, I think, both to understand what's happening and also to, as I say, feel good about what's happening. That is, and I don't mean necessarily approving of what's happening, but understanding what's happening. And that is really the big news of today. And that is that last night, a member of the Trump administration made a declaration in front of a court, a sworn declaration that said that Elon Musk is not employed by or at the head of the Department of Government Efficiency. That in fact, he is simply a senior advisor to the president and has no authority for hirings or firings or anything. And this, of course, was a surprise. It was also counter to everything that we have heard since December, when Trump said to the public that he was putting Musk in charge of the Department of Government Efficiency. But that department itself is incredibly vague. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows if it's actually an agency, which needs to be transparent and it has to follow a bunch of rules, or if it's something else. And whether or not you can do what Trump tried to do, which was to gut another agency and insert the Department of Government Efficiency inside of it. Nobody quite knows what's going on there. And this is all before courts, by the way. This isn't me just saying we don't know. Courts are saying, who the heck are you? And the people who are in charge of the Department of Justice are saying, we don't really know. So the fact that the Trump administration has now said, no, Musk has nothing to do with the Department of Government Efficiency, is what's going on there. So one of the things that's going on is there are 14 states that have sued to stop the Department of Government Efficiency from doing these mass firings that have sort of been underway, but really took off last Thursday. I think it was, maybe it was Friday, but I think it was last Thursday, and have continued over the weekend. We don't know how many people have been fired. We know it was very messily done, that theoretically the people who were fired, and I use the passive tense there, which you know I don't like to do, and I'll say more about that in a minute. We do know that theoretically they were people in a probationary period for the federal government, which usually means that it's the first year of their employment, but probationary periods also are associated with promotions or with moving from one job to another. So a lot of people got swept into it who had been with the federal government for more years than that. Veterans were swept in who theoretically should have had protection for the amount of years that they were in the service. The reason I mentioned that I don't like to use the passive voice and had to there was because when you use the passive voice, there is no actor. Which is one of the reasons it's not interesting to read passive voice. If you remember your English teacher saying, make it active, and you're thinking, what on earth is she talking about? The reason that people care about the active voice in writing is because somebody does something. So it's the difference between, the victim was murdered and Jane and John murdered the victim, right? In one case, Jane and John is doing the murdering. And that the reason I had to use passive voice in that, what I was just saying, is because it's really all extraordinarily vague. That is deeply problematic, but it speaks to a number of things. First of all, it speaks to the fact that that it's not clear who is doing what, and that is a real problem for our system of accountability. But it's also an assault on our constitutional system. And what I mean by that is this. We have the Constitution to the United States Constitution, which provides the framework for our laws. And they're quite clear. And when they're not clear, they're lawsuits, and they become clear. So one of the reasons that some laws go on forever is because there's always somebody who said, well, wait, I can get around this by doing this. And they have to amend the law. They have to make it so that it's clear. And it's very clear under our system of laws who's supposed to do what, and who is responsible for doing what, and who is to blame for doing what. And in the case, for example, of the firings that took place over the weekend, it's not clear who did it. So although Musk has been boasting that his Department of Government Efficiency has made those firings, now the administration says, well, no, actually he's not. He has no authority to do that. So it's the Office of Personnel Management. Well, the Office of Personnel Management is under the executive branch, but it is now full of people who are associated with Musk. So there's this vagueness and an inability for people to say, hey, you're the problem, here's the law, and here's how we're going to address the fact that you are breaking the law, because in the case of these firings, the law was not fired, or apparently not fired in most, if not all, of those cases. And there's already, I think, 5 lawsuits over it, but I could be wrong about the number of lawsuits. So that whole vagueness is important, both because it is erasing our normal channels of accountability. It makes it very hard to grasp onto somebody legally when they're sliding around and you can't tell who's in charge of them. It is also designed to erase the laws that check the power of the executive branch or the power of the president, because it's very hard to tell who's doing what. And in that case, the administration is simply taking the power and saying, we're going to do this. And by the time the courts catch up, it's going to be too late. So for U.S. aid, for example, which looks as if it is going to be found to be unconstitutional, is it going to matter that it's unconstitutional when there's no U.S. aid officers left? I mean, there's ways that you can use this vagueness and this time and this slipperiness to slow things down. And that, I think, is at least part of what's going on. All right, but there's another thing that is bothering me right now. So that's the big thing, is that now the administration is fudging about who's doing what. And by the way, and I will try to remember to come back to this, part of that is because there's been such pushback against it. I mean, part of the reason they're saying, oh, no, we were kidding or whatever, Elon Musk is not in charge, even though we said he was and he said he was, is because there is such furor over that. And that pressure is going to be really important to keep up. Okay, so there's something else here. There's one more thing here. A number of people have written to me with a piece that is going viral on Facebook that says that there's nothing that the Department of Government Efficiency is doing that Bill Clinton and Al Gore didn't do in the 1990s. Now, a couple of things about this. First of all, when you see these whataboutisms, That is classic disinformation. That is classic disinformation. So all of a sudden they're talking about Clinton and Al Gore, who were in the White House 30 years ago, and this is somehow a precedent for what the Department of Government Efficiency and the Trump administration are doing is the argument. But just to be clear, in fact, there was significant reform of the government under Clinton and Gore, but Congress passed a law, and they followed the law. They Clinton signed the law, and they followed the law, and that's how that downsizing happened. I mean, Al Gore didn't, or they certainly didn't bring in somebody from outside to do it without saying who was going to do what. And at the time, that was actually popular. You're not going to hear a lot of, you can Google it, by the way, there's a lot of really good articles about it. You're not going to hear a lot of people saying, oh, I knew it was terrible at the time. People were let go of jobs because they were able to retire, or there were actual procedures for figuring out who should be let go. They weren't these massive offloads of people the way you're seeing now with, they're getting their names wrong. They're saying all of them didn't perform, even though they've had good performance reviews. I mean, it's a very different thing now. But just so you know, when you see something viral like this now going around, I must have had, I don't know how many dozens of people send that to me. That's disinformation. That's somebody recognizing that that's really unpopular, and they're spreading out this idea all over the place that in fact there's nothing unusual about what's happening now, and somehow it's the Democrats who started this. At this point in your lives, anytime you see whataboutism that blames the Democrats, you should assume it's disinformation. And think about the way you live your own life. If somebody lies to you again and again and again and again, you might still love them. I can think of somebody like this in my life. But I don't believe anything they say without assuming it's been exaggerated or is a lie or something. And then you can check, and maybe sometimes that person will be right. But you have to start from the premise of that this is disinformation. And you should be doing that with all the stuff that comes across your desk. And the things that people are saying to me, what do I say about this? Can you answer this? And the answer is that is a technique of disinformation to tangle you in this downward spiral of, well, yeah, but look at this. Yeah, but. And as Stephen King says in his wonderful book on writing, anytime you say, yeah, but, you're losing. That's not a good conversation to have, because it's designed to, he's talking about it in a different context, but it's designed to waste your time and to get you into a rabbit hole that you can't get out of. So stop looking at this stuff and saying, wait a minute, what I see around me isn't right. Look, this happened before, because you're going to see a lot of it going forward. And I'm going to talk more about that now. All right. There's something that is worrying me that I'm not seeing enough. Somebody called my attention to it this weekend, and I think it's really important for people to understand. And that's that the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk are doing all kinds of things that are deeply disturbing. The cuts to the federal government in the many ways in which we care deeply about them. The fact that they have gotten permission to get into the United States Treasury's payment systems, and into the files from the United States Agency for International Development. And now over the weekend, they appear to have gotten permission to go into the files from the Internal Revenue Service. Now, remember how desperately Trump has protected any access to his own tax returns. And there are laws that protect those things. So they appear to have gotten permission to go into the IRS files and also into the Social Security Administration's files. All right, so think about what you have put on your taxes, especially those of you with children. You put on your taxes all your information, all your children's information, and deductions, which say a lot about what money you give, where your children might have special needs, any elderly people. And think also about what the Social Security Administration has for you. It has your Social Security number. It has all the jobs you've had for which you have had Social Security withheld. It has your address, and sometimes it has your medical records and other things that it might have. All right, so This is huge. All right, first of all, that is huge. It is an enormous breach of our privacy. And there are many reasons for you as an individual to be concerned about that. You might be concerned about Social Security payments. You might be concerned about any number of things that are in that material that now the Department of Government Efficiency, the people involved in it, have had access. As bad as that is, that's not what worries me. And here's a concept that I really hope people get and understand here. With the caveat that this is just what I'm thinking about, and I could be absolutely wrong, but I think it's worth having on your radar screen. So we're in the middle, aside from politics or anything else, we're in the middle, we humans are in the middle of a revolution. And that's the revolution that is enabled by the internet, by computing technologies and the internet. And those are both extraordinarily exciting because they can teach us things that we had no concept of being able to do otherwise. They can sequence genes, they can do all sorts of things. But they also have enormously frightening implications as well. Now, one of the ways that artificial intelligence becomes learns is by having data, by having lots and lots of data. Now, aside from perhaps China, which is using its AI in ways that can be very frightening, aside from China, is there any organization in the world that has more data about humans than the United States government? Maybe. But this is an enormous pool of data, and an enormous pool of data that now a lot of appears to be in the hands of Elon Musk, who is, of course, trying to develop his own artificial intelligence companies to rival those of Sam Altman, for example, with OpenAI, and with some of the other people who are trying to develop AI. Sorry, my foot is caught on something that's making me crazy. All right. So even today, he came up with Grok 3. That was the new version of his old AI, and now he's got all this data, and what can you do with that data? So now I'm going to make a little bit of a leap here to put something together, and this is the piece that I think you need to understand, and that's advertising. I know that seems like a real leap, but it's a really important concept, because when you think about yourself as a consumer, you probably think that you're valuable to a company because you're going to buy a refrigerator, or you're going to buy a new pair of shoes, or, they need to know you're going to buy some kind of a service. But that's actually not why you're valuable. And there's a really interesting history to this. You're valuable because if a company knows a lot about you, it can aggregate you with other people, and it can then say to the person who produces the shoes or the refrigerator, hey, I can guarantee you that these people are going to buy your product if only you advertise in this certain way. And this came actually from a really interesting study that was done in the 1930s by a man named Frank Stanton, who at the time was a doctoral candidate, and he wanted to understand how people used new technologies. So what he did was he put onto radios what he told people was a way to measure how much electricity the radios used. But in fact, that wasn't what it did. Instead of just measuring electricity, what the things he put on the boxes did is they measured the way that families use the radio. What programs they listen to, how often they listen to those programs. And then after, I think it was a month, he came back and he asked those people to self-report how they had used the radio in that time. And what he discovered was they self-reported things that were very different than what they actually had done. So they talked about listening to educational programs when in fact they were listening to, much more less educational, sort of more popular stuff. And he recognized that if you could figure out what people were really doing, you could take that data and you could go to an advertiser and you could say, hey, listen, the people who listen to this radio show can be bundled in such a way that you can sell this product to them. And that's the level he was at in the 1930s, late 1930s. He went on to become the president of CBS. His name is Frank Stanton. And that idea of packaging people in data spaces is now central to the use of social media. So if you think about the rise of Cambridge Analytica in 2015, 2016, before the election of 2016, the point of Cambridge Analytica was, do you remember all those games that there were on Facebook that said things like, which beetle are you and which dog are you? And what they did is they got a whole bunch of people to show them what they cared about. And they were able in that election to target advertising at people to urge them to vote for Donald Trump. Now, there's a big fight about how effective that was, and there's a fight among IT people through political scientists about how effective that was. But the idea that if you know a lot about people, you can sell them things in a certain way is very much at the heart of the use of social media. Now, we don't really have a lot of very good privacy laws around social media, but we do have very good privacy laws around our personal data that the IRS has or Social Security has, right? Except now that data at least appears to have been put into the hands of somebody who's trying to build this large AI machine, all right? So think about it. If you can aggregate our data and say, for example, these people appear to be fomenting trouble against the administration, or these people appear to be people that you could get to bow out of politics altogether, or these people could be urged to violence, you suddenly have the kinds of surveillance state and political state that national security people have been very concerned about with authoritarian states. And that is extremely concerning when the person whose hands into whose hands this data is falling is somebody who has in so many countries been encouraging right-wing authoritarianism. But there is a link there, I think, to the Trump administration's new friendliness with Russia. Because, of course, this is what Russia did to help Trump in 2016 and has continued to do to unbalance politics in democracies. So when I look at where we are, I am very concerned about the pieces of it, but I think we better be paying attention to the larger piece, or the larger picture. And I hope I'm wrong. I mean, this it just sounds too crazy in too many ways. But if there's even a chance that this could happen, I think we need to be aware of it. And I can't imagine why otherwise Musk is making such a play for everybody's data. And, he says it's about fraud and waste and corruption. They haven't produced any fraud and waste and corruption at all. They keep saying, oh, there's all this stuff, and the right wing is reproducing it. Oh, we found all these people who are collecting Social Security checks, and they're 150 years old. And anybody who follows IT at all knows that that's part of the program on which Social Security was written, that if there is a default number, it goes to 1875 in that particular case. So, that's just crap. I mean, he hasn't produced anything, and courts have said, you have not produced anything. You keep saying this, but you haven't produced anything. And once again, the federal government has had, anyway, its own inspectors, both inspectors general, until Trump fired 18 of them the other day, who are independent investigators of the departments, and also the General Accountability Office, which the GAO, which investigates constantly. That's its job. It's nonpartisan. It goes ahead and investigates, and in fact had turned up significant amounts of fraud from the administration of the COVID bills when Trump was president, and they now have all been fired. And there, of course, is also the fact that the FBI also investigates fraud, particularly healthcare fraud. So this idea that somehow somebody wrote to me last night and said, how was there all this fraud there and no one caught it? And the answer is, first of all, the government catches fraud all the time. But second of all, Musk has not produced anything. He keeps saying he's going to. I remember there keep being these deadlines, and last week he put up the Department of Government Efficiency website, and it was, first of all, blank, and then when they built it out over, I guess it was across Wednesday and Thursday, it was so badly built out that a whole bunch of people hacked it and said things like, these experts don't know what they're doing. And then he said, well, we'll have it by the end of the weekend, and this is now Tuesday, and I haven't looked today, but there hasn't been anything. So that reach for our data, both, I think, to force us onto his platforms, to use his platforms for our financial exchanges, for example, and to be able to adjust society is something I think that that we better have in mind. Okay, a couple other things. The SAVE Act. There's a bunch of things that people have asked about. The SAVE Act, once again, I think I articulated this here, is a problem in search of a solution in search of a problem. It is designed theoretically to guarantee that non-citizens don't vote, but it's already against the law for non-citizens to vote, and and it's incredibly rare for that to happen. But what the SAVE Act does do is it really cuts back on who can vote, especially women who have changed their names when they got married, because it says that you have to have a birth certificate with your current name on it or a passport. Right now, the law is very vaguely written. It's a little hard to know if it would be okay to bring in a marriage license or whatever. But the SAVE Act, I think, is emblematic of something bigger and worth knowing about, because what the SAVE Act sets out to do is to stop, as I say, voter fraud, which is incredibly rare. But what it does is it perpetrates something that is not rare in the United States, and that's election fraud. That's when you take an election and you alter the conditions of it in such a way that the people who are going to vote against you can't vote, through voter suppression, through things like having a change in documentation so that women can't vote because they changed their names. That's something that I think is indicative of what this administration is hoping to do, and that's to make sure that in the future it'll be harder and harder to knock Republicans out of office. And that's what people who study authoritarianism, people like, for example, I'm not going to say this actually because I've read this, but I'm not sure which one of them it was. People who study authoritarianism have said they think that's the direction the United States is going, where we do have elections, but it's almost impossible for the opponents of the ruling party to win them. And that's the SAVE Act is coming up, I think it's on the 23rd of this month. They're going to be discussing it in Congress, and that's something to speak up about as well. So another thing that is worth pointing out here is there are a number of special elections coming up. An election for the Supreme Court in Wisconsin. I shouldn't even say what I think the dates are. You should look it up because, again, off the top, I've been doing something else all day. So off the top of my head, I'm afraid I'll get it wrong. But if you have any, if you're looking to put some energy, that's a really important election because it is that Supreme Court that will decide whether, plus there'll be one more election before before 2030. But in that particular election, if the Republicans win this special election, the Democrats can't win back control of the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, and therefore the Republicans will once again have control of gerrymandering in the state of Wisconsin. When they did the similar thing in Michigan and the Democrats finally won it back and got the fair maps that the voters had requested, even though those fair maps did favor Republicans because of the way things fall, the population falls in Minnesota. In Michigan, the Democrats won all three branches of, both houses and the governorship. And the same is almost certain to happen in states like Wisconsin, North Carolina, the places where they have been gerrymandered within an inch of your life, because they don't gerrymander states that they were going to win anyway. You look at Massachusetts, which always votes Democratic. It's not gerrymandered. There's no need to gerrymander it. The Democrats know they're going to win. So if you see a gerrymandered state, you see a state that the whatever party has gerrymandered it thinks it cannot win in free and fair elections. And those are overwhelmingly Republican states at this point. All right, so there is the special election in Wisconsin, but there are also two special elections coming up in Florida. They're in deep red districts, but they would go a long way to being able to neuter what the Republicans have been doing in the House of Representatives. So, okay, so here's a number of questions that people have asked about. We've got an awful lot going on in Congress right now. And you got to remember that the Republicans hold control of the House and the Senate and the White House. Not by much. If you take those in reverse order, Trump did win the White House, but more people voted for somebody other than him than voted for him. If you look at the Senate, the Republicans have 3 seats, a 3-seat majority. And if you look at the House of Representatives, I think it's either 2 or 3 seats. I could be wrong. It might be a few more than that, but these are razor thin majorities. And here's the problem for the Republican Party. The problem is that they are bitterly divided. So in the House of Representatives, which is where bills for revenue must begin, the House Freedom Caucus, the far right caucus, and the real person who speaks a lot about that is Chip Roy from Texas. They are furious at the growth of the national debt, and they want to slash the government down to nothing, both out of principle, because they think they don't want a government, but also because of the expense of it. And they don't want any increases, for example, in the debt limit, because they don't want to add to the national debt. And the debt limit, if you remember, is this weird thing that we have. I believe the only other country that's got something like this is Denmark, but it's not a political football over there. All the debt limit it comes from World War I. And until World War I, anytime the government needed to raise money, Congress told the Treasury what to do. And by that, I mean, quite literally, they would say, well, we need to raise $6 million or let's say $16 million. And the best way to do that is for us to sell bonds. But let's decide if the bond should last for 5 years at 3% or at 7 years at 2%, and those conversations could go on for a very long time. Believe me, I read them all for the Civil War. But by the time we got to World War I, the government was spending so much money to fight that war, Congress couldn't have done anything other than raise money. So what they said to the Treasury is, go ahead, we'll set a limit to which you have to adhere. And then we don't care how you raise that money. Sell bonds, we don't care. Just raise it up to here. And then if you need more money, come back to us and we'll decide if we should stop raising money or if we should just raise the debt ceiling. It was never an issue until very recently. And the reason for that is because always in American history, always, 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 from 1861, beginning of the Civil War, through 1981, the beginning of the Reagan era, whenever there was a mismatch between how much money the government was spending and how much money the government was taking in, unless it was wartime, in which there was an understanding that the government would spend a lot more than it took in simply because of the demands of a war. The way that Congress handled it was they did try to cut back on certain things, but they also just raised taxes. They raised taxes on those people who had more money than everybody else. And this began actually right in 1861. We get our first progressive tax, our first income tax. It was the Republicans who invented that. But so once you get Reagan in there, and then George H.W. Bush raises taxes. Remember, he gets elected saying, "Read my lips, no more taxes, no new taxes." And then he has to back off on that because Reagan has created such a deficit during his term. And that's one of the reasons that the Republican Party turns against him and ends up destroying his bid for re-election. But what happens is that with those taxes in the omnibus bill that George H.W. Bush was willing to sign, and then with some things that Clinton did, the government actually ran a surplus in the 1990s, all right? Ran a surplus. More money came in than went out. The government ran a surplus in the 1990s, all right? So what happens is when George W. Bush gets elected in 2000, even before Congress comes back into session, he goes for a huge tax cut with the argument in part that if you have money coming in, people are going to use it for things like roads and schools and hospitals, and they want to get rid of that government, and they also want to get rid of the regulation that goes along with it. So George W. Bush has these huge tax cuts, and then he has two unfunded wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. And the argument is, from Reagan forward, that cutting taxes will spur economic growth. And the argument is that if you have a government that regulates business and that collects taxes, especially from people with a lot of money, what that means is that it hampers innovation and it hampers an individual's ability to spend their money in ways that are enormously productive. So the argument is that a bunch of government bureaucrats won't be able to spend that money in a way that efficiently uses the markets. So essentially you want to get the government out of things and let individuals ride the market, because that'll be far more efficient. And as they build the government, as they build this economy, it's going to bring in more tax dollars, and everybody's going to be able to have everything they want so long as you cut taxes. Well, the problem with that was it has never worked. It has never worked. That was the idea. In fact, in 1981, when David Stockman, who was Reagan's director of the Office of Management and Budget, put the tax cuts that they were planning into the government computers, the government computers just said, you're going to blow out the deficit and you're not going to see the kind of money you're talking about. And so they just reprogrammed the computers. In fact, we had between 1981 and 2021 is that about $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. And everybody keeps asking me where I get that statistic, so here's where you find it. Google it. An article from Time magazine comes up. Just Google $50 trillion 1981 2021, and this article from Time will come up, and it links to the study that established this. But it's actually not challenged. Robert Reich talks about it. Thomas Piketty talks about it. If you look at income inequality, it's a pretty widely accepted statistic. Anyway, so that's the argument behind the tax cuts, the increasing tax cuts. And you saw the same thing with Trump's first term with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, with the argument that if you cut taxes for the wealthy and corporations, it would create jobs, because there would be all this extra money in the economy and it would be invested and it would create new businesses and more people would have jobs and everything would be great. In fact, as you probably know, Trump added a quarter of our national debt before COVID to our debt. And the new extension of those tax cuts, they're supposed to expire in 2025. The extension of that is projected by the nonpartisan congressional office that does that, to add, I think it's 4.6 trillion to our debt. So to go back to where I was, the problem for the Republicans is that the far right Republicans don't want to add to that debt. But the more mainstream Republicans want those tax cuts. And right now, it does not look like they're going to be able to figure that out. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that the funding for our government until, I think it's March 14th, but again, I don't have the numbers in front of me. The funding of our government runs out on that date, and we need to have something in place or the government will have to shut down. And not entirely, but they shut down the national parks and they shut down a whole bunch of different things. So they need to have that in place. But House Speaker Mike Johnson wants to do a short-term continuing resolution. And there's two problems with that. One is, if Musk has really found all this waste and fraud in the current budget, why would you continue it? You know, that doesn't make any sense at all. And the Senate Republicans came out last week, and I haven't written about this yet, but I thought it was fascinating. The Senate Republicans wrote a letter to Trump saying, listen, you need to extend these tax cuts permanently. We're holding on for that. We don't want any short-term crap. We want a permanent extension of those tax cuts. Now, why are they doing it? They're probably doing it for a number of reasons, not least of which, I hate to do this to you, but because Musk has threatened to primary anybody who doesn't do what he and Trump want, if in fact the senators deliver these long-term tax cuts for the very wealthy and for corporations, they might very well have their own base of financing that will enable them to move away from worrying about Trump and Musk. All right, so this is why the Republicans are in real trouble, but I'm not done yet. The other problem, of course, is that on January 21st of this year, the Treasury hit the need to use extraordinary measures so that we would not hit that debt ceiling. So if we hit the debt ceiling and we can't pay our bills, the financial system across the country and probably across the world is going to collapse. So that debt ceiling has to be raised. Or we have to completely destroy the government so we don't actually spend any money. But the Freedom Caucus people don't want the debt ceiling to be raised. The rest of the Republicans want to pass laws that are going to increase the debt by more than $4 trillion over 10 years. I should have said that, over 10 years. And they don't have large margins in Congress. So where does this leave us? This leaves us with a lot of Republicans trying to say the Democrats are going to shut down the government, because they're trying to force the Democrats to come on board to join them, because they know they can't get the Republicans to vote. This is literally who Republican voters voted for, Chip Roy and the people who are with that far-right Freedom Caucus. Mazie from Kentucky is another one. And they need those Democratic votes. The Democrats are now saying, this is not our problem. You are in control of the House and the Senate and the White House. If you're going to mess around with our finances the way you're talking about doing, it is on your head, not on our head. So when you start to hear these claims that the Democrats are shutting down the government, that's, again, because the Republicans can't get their acts together. And that's what's going on that front, and really needs to be continually hammered on, because the one other thing that was here, because there's a larger game here afoot, of course, and that's that the Democrats are saying, listen, we're happy to help with the government, but not when you're destroying the government. So you need to back off of all the crap that Musk and Trump and crew are doing before we're going to vote for anything. And that's the sort of the larger picture here. And I know it's really in the weeds, but again, just to get us out of the weeds here, what we're really talking about is the American government and how the American government works. And what we have right now, people have said to me, are we in danger of a coup? And I maintain we are in a constitutional coup. We're in a constitutional crisis in which people are trying to take over our government and disregard our laws. And again, what I mean by that is that the Constitution sets out very clearly that it's Congress that passes the laws. Congress passes the laws. The president signs them or vetoes them, but once they're in place, the president takes an oath to faithfully execute the laws. And to the degree that this administration is firing people and defunding things like U.S. aid, which is blatantly unconstitutional because of the idea that the Congress funds these laws and the Congress writes these laws and the executive must execute them. The fact that they're firing people against the law and so on they say they are trying to challenge the idea that Congress alone can have control over the laws. They want to center that power in the executive branch. And their hope, according to the documents that have been released, is to throw the case in front of the Supreme Court with the idea that the Supreme Court will say, yeah, the president can go ahead and do this because he is the head of the executive branch. But before you think, oh, they're going to do that automatically, remember that what the Supreme Court said in Trump versus U.S. in July of 2024 was that Trump or the president can't be criminally charged for actions taken within his Article 2 powers. And that the court has to decide what those are. And Article 2 is the reference to the part of the Constitution that lays out the power of the president. That says nothing about Article 1 powers. And Article 1 powers are the powers of Congress, which are very clear in the Constitution that it's Congress and Congress alone that makes the laws. So it's not entirely clear that the Supreme Court would in fact side with Trump in this, not least because if he doesn't need Congress, he sure doesn't need the courts. And I think that John Roberts, in any case, is going to be eager to make sure he doesn't write himself out of a job. So we're in this extraordinary mess right now. But let me now give you some good news. And that is that Musk and the administration would not be backing away from the Department of Government Efficiency if everything was going swimmingly. Things have really been disastrous so far for this administration. And I don't just mean the rollouts of things like U.S. aid, where we're hearing horror stories, for example, recently of a U.S. aid worker in a country that didn't have good medical care, who was, of course, promised that his family would be medevaced out if there were any issues, and his wife is in a high-risk pregnancy, and the Trump administration just left her in the care of the medical situation in the country where she is. And that's horrific. This is somebody that we promised as people that we would take care of if they worked for us, and instead his family is at risk now because of the actions of the Trump administration. So that has been, not gone terribly well. The recognition that they fired the people who guard our nuclear stockpiles and had to find them and hire them back. There's any number of ways in which this rollout has not gone well. One of the guys who went into the Treasury payment system had to be let go because it turned out he was making really outrageous statements of racism and flirting with Nazism. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that hasn't gone terribly well, but even more visibly than that, the way that the administration has turned its back on Europe, our NATO allies, and turned toward Russia and Hungary is causing a lot of backlash, even among the Republican Party. And Pete Hegseth's performance in Brussels, which came right before the Munich conference last weekend, he was at Brussels at the meeting of the defense ministers to protect Ukraine. he just looked like a fool. I mean, he was largely inarticulate. He had to walk back what he had said, and he referred to it again in the passive voice, a statement that was made, and he was the one who made the statement. Um, and then the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Roger Wicker, a Republican of Mississippi, called his performance in Brussels a rookie mistake. The administration it's really basically stepping on one rake after another. The other thing that is happening in the midst of all this is, of course, the legal pushback, and the people who are fighting against the Trump administration have so far won everything across the board. But more than that, I think, and I hope, Americans are themselves pushing back. They are turning out for organized demonstrations against the firing of the people who work for us, against the power of Elon Musk, for whom nobody voted, against the power of the Department of Government Efficiency. And we're swamping the switchboards at Congress, both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and showing up at state houses and really putting pressure on people. And you got to remember, it takes about 3.5% of a country to change the public conversation. And as we are seeing, the cuts that the Trump administration is making are justified with the idea that they're going after diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Musk tweeted a picture of himself dressed as a Roman gladiator who was making war on woke over the weekend. But the reality is, as people like me have always said, political scientists and historians, it's the Republican-dominated states that get the most money and support from the federal government. So right now, farmers who voted for Trump by a margin of 3-1 are watching $2 billion of purchases from USAID disappear. They're watching retaliatory tariffs from Canada, for example. They're watching Canada and other countries making bilateral agreements with other countries for the grains and the agricultural products that they used to sell. This is a crisis for the family farm. And as you know, the Project 2025 calls for getting rid of family farms and the rise of agribusiness because they say it's more efficient. That's in Project 2025. So farmers are hurting really badly, and they're hurting for things like the cease in funding for the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a partnership with the federal government, where if you invested in new fencing and in technologies that enabled you to use less energy, the government would help you. And now the government is simply not paying its share, even though the farmers are already on the hook for their share. So that population is angry and not so keen on what DOGE is, or the Department of Government Efficiency, what I call DOGGY, is doing. Similarly, the cuts to the National Institutes of Health badly hurt Republican states because this brings tons of money into their states, and the cuts to the Department of Education really badly will hurt Republican-dominated states because they take far more money from the federal government through the form of grants to low-income regions than the Democratic-dominated states do. So this allegiance is unstable, and in addition, the threatened cuts to Medicaid. There's talk about cuts to Medicare and Social Security, although Trump has always said he would defend those. But cuts to Medicaid, which is what the Republicans in Congress are talking about, is going to devastate Republican-dominated states and the key MAGA voters. And Steve Bannon is the one who's been pointing this out, saying, do not go after Medicaid. Those are the MAGA voters. So this whole thing that seems so frightening, and that is in fact a constitutional crisis, and is devastating our country in so many ways, is still profoundly unstable. This is not a done deal. And now is the time really to speak up and to really put pressure, especially on Republicans, but also on Democrats, to protect our government and to protect our Constitution. Now, a number of people have written to me saying, wouldn't it be a good idea for somebody to do every night a roundup of what happened during the day? I can't agree with you more. I'm going to try and do more of these myself. Unfortunately, it's Maine in February, and I got snowed in my house because it's in my house. I'm across the way, and I got snowed in and couldn't do any for the last couple of days. But this is a great idea. I think people are going to be pushing it. Pete Buttigieg is now on Blue Sky, and he's always great wherever he is. I think you're going to see more and more of this coming from the Democrats, but I'm going to emphasize to you once again, a number of people keep writing to me saying, where's our hero? Where's our leader? And I just want to emphasize that we're the ones who are going to create that leader. Abraham Lincoln didn't come from the heavens. We created Abraham Lincoln. And the more pressure that we put on our political system to do what we want it to do, the better the chances are that we're going to get a leader who does what we want. The same way that the radical right produced Donald Trump, we can produce the leader that we want. And I don't know who that's going to be at all. I could maybe have some guesses, and maybe we don't know yet. But the more we speak up, not only in reaction to what the Trump people are doing, but saying, this is what I want out of my government. These are the things that I care about. Hey, listen, I care about free and fair votes. I'm really upset about the SAVE Act, and that's something I'm going to put some muscle behind. You can't do everything, but to the degree that you can articulate what it is you want your government to do, and if lucky, why, that's how you change this public conversation, because there is not support for what's happening. There is not a mandate for what Trump is doing. And you can see this, by the way, when you see articles. I saw one recently that said Frank Luntz, who is a Republican operative, says the Democrats love what Trump is doing. That's a planted story. I could make something up right now too. But to the degree you're seeing pushback about how popular all this stuff is, think about it. Think about it in your own life. Do you see people saying this is great? I mean, you see some people, of course, but this is not like, some great moment where people are saying, my God, I love this. Some people are behind it, but I'm seeing an awful lot of people who either were quiet before or even voted Republicans saying, wait a minute, I didn't vote for you to cut Medicaid. That's what my mother lives on. And that instability means that we're in a period in which, as I say, there's a lot of power going around, and we can direct that power if we continue to step up, if we continue to push back everywhere we can on anything that's a lie. If we continue to insist on the kind of country that we want, I suspect what we're going to find, if we are successful, is that a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump were hoping to get rich people out of the way of ordinary people. That in fact, they really think this system is gamed for the rich. And here's a news flash. It is. In that, we share common ground with an awful lot of people in this country who don't want handouts. They want a fair playing field. And that's not just people of color. It's not just women. It's poor men. It's poor, it's people who are on the make. It's immigrants. It's people who say, listen, I love America because it lets me be anything I want to be. But when everything is sewn up for, the 813 people, I saw the statistic yesterday, in America, who have more money than the bottom 60%, you got a problem. And this is the moment to articulate that and to demand solutions to it. Because if we don't demand solutions within our democratic system, the solutions will come from authoritarianism. And that's really close. It hasn't won yet, but the fact we have turned away from our European allies is having them start to warn against us. As someone said, we are now the bad guys. It's not written in stone yet, but we must speak up about it now before it becomes written in stone, while those people trying to establish that are really insecure. Because once they're in power, if I'm right about what Musk is doing, it's going to be irretrievable. I still think we can do it. All right, I was all over the map today, but thank you for being here. And like I say, I'll try and do these more frequently. If you could stop the ice from coming out of the sky for a while here in Maine, I'd be able to do them more often. Anyway, thank you for being here, and I will talk to you soon. Take care. Hey, Canada. Hey, Danny, how are you? Oh, that's a really famous town. You should go. To the hot springs. There was a huge struggle there between Indigenous Americans and the U.S. Army. South Carolina. Hope you're okay on the fires. Philadelphia. Yeah. Here's Matthew saying we love you, Canada. Just outside of Chicago. Is it cold? It's finally warmed up a little bit here in New England. All right, I'm going to jump right into stuff today because, I've been on the road and I'm going back on the road on Thursday. And what that means is that when I am at home, all the meetings pile up. And I just had a meeting that was supposed to go till 5, ended early. So I had time to run on here because I want to make sure I say some things this week. And I'm going to try, as I say, to do these more often. And yes, I know Facebook is not going to continue to keep videos. We're moving them over to YouTube, and I'm going to be going live from YouTube and squad casting on here to Facebook going forward. But I want to start with something that's really important. So what happened on February 28th in the Oval Office was really important for all the reasons that I've written about, that it was the turn away of the United States from the post-World War II order in which we supported democracies around the world and supported the UN and supported NATO and so on. But that's not actually what I want to talk about. I wrote a letter about it that day. Feel free to go read it. It's February 28th. But what I wanted to talk about was something else. What happened in that meeting, again, as we know now, looking back, what was happening was that Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance were setting up Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky so that they would have an excuse for ceasing for the U.S. to support Ukraine, even though the Congress voted for it to do so, and it is illegal and unconstitutional for them to stop that. But they were trying to set him up. It was very clearly set up. Vice President Vance isn't normally at a meeting like that. That's a presidential meeting. There wouldn't normally be a vice president there. And as I wrote about, they gave credentials to Russian state media, did not give it to Reuters or to the Associated Press for the U.S. It was clearly a setup. But something happened there. And what happened was that when Zelensky started to hint that Trump was handing the U.S. over to Russia when he repeatedly said, "You will feel pressured," which is exactly what happened to Ukraine under Russia. Trump lost it. I mean, you can go look at this tape. It's available video. It's available on YouTube. And you can see all of a sudden Trump cracks and he just pitches a conniption fit. And that really matters because watching that, you will see he loses control. He loses control of the situation, and it turns out to be a complete disaster when all of a sudden he starts talking about Hunter Biden's laptop and Hillary Clinton and Adam Schiff. And I mean, it just becomes a real nightmare. And again, Trump is not in good mental shape. So the reason I say that is because it was clear to anybody watching it, and you can go watch it yourself, it was clear to anybody watching it that it was a complete public relations nightmare for the White House. Aside from everything else, it was terrible. Now, since then, and this is what I wanted to highlight today, social media especially has been flooded with all sorts of excuses for what happened. And you've been sending them to me. Things like saying that Zelensky called Vance an epithet, and so Vance got mad, or saying that Zelensky has stolen billions of dollars in aid, even though Trump's own special envoy to Russia and Ukraine says, no, we know where all the money has gone. And it's mostly been material anyway. We've seen all this stuff, including today, I've started to see things circulating about former President Bill Clinton talking positively about Putin in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union. And people are saying, well, how come it was okay for a Democrat to do it, but not for a Republican to do it? And just on that front, that was 35 years ago. The world has changed, and Putin has changed, and many things have changed in 35 years. But the reason I wanted to call that out is because people keep writing to me and saying, is this true? Is this true? And you need to internalize the answer is no. What you are seeing and what you are experiencing is classic disinformation. That is, the facts are easily obtainable. This is why I put citations down. What happened was that in 1994, Ukraine had about a third of the world's nuclear weapons because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the United Kingdom, the United States, and Russia all guaranteed that if Ukraine gave up those nuclear weapons, those three countries would guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty at the borders where they were. Now, I'm not going to give you the entire history of all the countries involved, but in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine and took Crimea, which is part of Ukraine. And then in 2022, it invaded again to take at least 4 eastern oblasts, that is, regions of Ukraine. And they have been bombing civilian areas and torturing people and killing civilians and, and kidnapping children. I mean, this is not a gray area at all. But what you are seeing is the flooding of our social media by Russians or Russian adjacent voices that are trying to convince you that what you are seeing is not real. And mind you, what I am saying, you can check this. You do not have to take my word for it. You can check what happened. You can check it even in places like Wikipedia, which certainly has weaknesses, but is a pretty good summary of what we understand. So you can check these things. But when people send that stuff to you and circulate that stuff to you, they are trying to weaken you and they are trying to weaken the United States of America. Because instead of you being out there saying, what are you talking about? Russia's kidnapping children and murdering, destroying Bucha and destroying, the invading these borders that it promised to hold steady. Instead of doing that, you're now saying, wait a minute, let me figure out if this is true so I can answer the people saying this. This is classic disinformation. It sends you into a no-win situation where you're like, but wait, let me explain it to you. Let me explain. You can't explain it to those people. That's not the point. The point is to waste your time. Now let me move this in so you stop doing you stop feeling certain and you stop doing the things that would stop this. So let me put it in personal terms. You all know people who do this, who behave this way. They are dominating you through the conversation. So, if you go to your roommate and you say, I'm sorry, I'm tired, I'm not going to come up with a good example. But they come back and say, well, what about this? And you end up, if you say, did you take my mail? And they say, well, yes, I did. But what about yesterday when you didn't do the dishes? And then all of a sudden you're arguing about the dishes instead of the original problem. This is what you are seeing. Stop looking at these things and saying, wow, is this true? I didn't know this. It's not true. This is why they are doing it. And you see it also with the Department of Government Efficiency, where they were circulating a whole bunch of things saying, well, this is what Clinton and Al Gore did in the 1990s. First of all, if you have to go back into the 1990s to justify yourself, you're in trouble. But second of all, it's simply not true. Clinton and Gore put in place a gradual reduction in force that was passed in a law by Congress. That's completely different than Elon Musk, apparently, and his team coming in and just taking a sledgehammer to our government. So when you see those arguments and you're trying to be fair-minded and you're trying to say, well, is this true or is this not true? They are taking advantage of your good nature and your willingness to entertain alternative viewpoints in order to weaken you and to weaken the idea of American democracy. Now, that's not to say that you have to believe everything that somebody like me tells you. I make mistakes, and anybody who is in the field of delivering knowledge makes mistakes, and they acknowledge that they make mistakes and they correct them. That's how the world works. If people are saying to you, well, you're just missing out on the fact that one I heard the other day was that it was really Zelensky who started the war. He invaded his own country. That's not how that works. Now, you can have a much longer discussion about geopolitics and, whether there were moves that were made in the 1990s that weren't fabulous, or whether there are moves being made now that aren't fabulous. That's perfectly legitimate discussion. But what is at stake is American democracy and the world order. It's fine to have that discussion, but this is not what's going on here in this picture. And that I really, really wanted to say. Somebody has just said, I spin the facts as much as the other side. In all the years I've been doing this, nobody has ever come at me and said, here are the facts where you are wrong. They call me stupid. They say that I'm doing things like spinning, all those things. When you can come to me with facts, and by the way, I do get those in my email from people who are concerned and they're like, I think you missed something. And the truth is, I learned from them and I say so. And if I made a mistake, I correct it. So again, this is an attempt to get rid of a reality-based community. You want to argue with me? You come to me with actual facts of things that happened. Not what Tucker Carlson told you and not what, Donald Trump is saying. We need actual facts in order to reestablish democracy. All right, so let me tell you, and let me answer the questions about some of the things that you asked. People asked, why is Trump putting on tariffs right now? Because it makes no freaking sense. He inherited an incredibly strong economy. All he had to do was go drink Diet Cokes and play golf and keep things on a relatively even keel. And he has chosen not to do that. It is he's crashing the stock market, and it certainly looks as if our economic growth is going to go from about plus 2.9, which is what it was at the end of, it's projected to be at the end of January. It is now negative 2.8. He's actually contracting the economy, which means people are going to lose jobs. Why would one do that? Well, I don't know. I'm not in Trump's head, but let me tell you what the options are. One is that, and this is what I thought I was going to see, and right now, to my knowledge, I am not seeing it. But again, we certainly don't have all the information, and that is that I expected that this was going to be about kickbacks. He would say to he would say, I'm going to put tariffs on everything coming in from Canada and from Mexico. And that would make the major U.S. automakers, for example, and the major U.S. producers go to him and say, I really need an exception for my stuff. And, maybe it would be a really good thing if I held my next convention at your hotel. And, let's just put 30 million toward that. And that would be really helpful then if we didn't have the tariffs. I thought we were going to see kickbacks. I may or may not have been wrong on that. But the other piece of this is that he is trying to justify these extraordinary extensions of the 2017 tax cuts. And he is talking about an extension for 10 years. They're supposed to expire in 2025, and these are the tax cuts that give such benefits to the wealthy and to businesses. The Republican senators are talking about making those permanent. Now, just again, to reiterate, the reason we have a budget deficit is not because of all the money we're spending on civil servants whose numbers have not gone up in 50 years. That is, they went up briefly in 1990, and that was the peak, and now they're about where they were 50 years ago, although the country has grown by 2/3. What has increased is government contractors. Those have gone up by 5%. By 5 times. Not by 5%, but by 5 times. Nobody is talking about cutting those. So what has caused the increase is not the government workers. What has caused the increase are the tax cuts under George W. Bush. Remember that under Clinton, who came before him, the budget was actually running a surplus. George W. Bush cut taxes and began the deficit, ran 2 unfunded wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then now we got the Trump tax cuts of 2017. When he was in office in his first term, Trump increased the deficit by 25%, by about a quarter of the entire debt we had before COVID. Okay, so the thing about the tariffs is that Trump wants to extend those tax cuts, but the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan people who rank how much a law is going to cost, that's the CBO if you've ever seen that, they say those tax cuts are going to increase the U.S. debt by $6 trillion over 10 years. So Trump has been saying that we can do that because tariffs are going to bring in so much money. And he keeps trying to tell people that tariffs bring in money from other countries. They don't. They bring in money from consumers at home. And because they are regressive, that is, it's according to how much you buy. But, somebody who makes $1 gazillion isn't going to buy any more soup than somebody who makes, $15,000 a year. The taxes tend to fall regressively, they tend to fall on ordinary people. So he might be putting these tariffs on simply to excuse his taxes. Or finally, one of the things that we're important to remember in this moment is that there's a lot of people running around in the government, at the head of the government right now, who don't have the same interests. So sometimes they coincide and sometimes they don't coincide. And right now it certainly appears as if Trump has handed the presidency over to Elon Musk, rather as if Musk is the prime minister and Trump is the president, if you will, is overseeing things. And that's something that tech entrepreneur Curtis Yarvin called for in one of his manifestos about what he would like a technology-oriented government to do. That's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go into. I have written about Curtis Yarvin. You people ask me about that. I've written about him on at least 2 occasions. And you can search those things on Facebook or on Substack. Just search for the keyword. Facebook's search engine is better than Substack's in my experience. All right. So the other piece of this, and what the reason I just said there's different things going on, Elon Musk has spoken frequently and very complimentarily of the person who's in charge of Argentina right now, Milei. His name is Javier Milei. And he took Argentina's economy, which was in real bad shape, and he cut it dramatically. He's the first guy with a chainsaw. And he got all the attention for doing the chainsaw. And what he did was he simply slashed everything. And now they're trying to rebuild the economy. But the trick to that is if you slash everything, if you get rid of all the government services, what happens is that you can sell off all those assets of the government. And watch for the word asset. Assets of the government, because this is language that's it's been for a while, to come out of the Trump White House. And the United States government has a lot of assets. And I'm not talking about what I consider assets, our people, our health, our natural resources, all that. I'm talking about what they look at on a ledger book. And that is things that are valuable. And some of those things are real estate, for example. And you've certainly seen how the Department of Government Efficiency team has gotten into the General Services Administration and is selling off real estate. But it's also our natural resources. And this is something that I'm watching very closely because 3 days ago, I think it was, I've lost track of the days as usual, Trump has called for timber harvesting in our national forests. And I'm very concerned about the idea of selling off our natural resources to private investors, especially in the American West. So it may simply be that the idea is to crash the economy so that everything becomes very cheap. And then people with money can pick it up cheaply. And that is another possible answer. Or maybe, I don't have any insight here as to what the way he's thinking. Maybe he just likes the word tariff. Who knows? But it makes truly zero economic sense to do what he's doing. And I'm not against tariffs in certain ways, but this is simply a way to destroy the U.S. economy. And incidentally, that idea of privatizing public goods is exactly what Viktor Orban did in Hungary, is doing in Hungary, but also what Vladimir Putin did in Russia when he began to rise to power. All right. So another couple of questions here, and that is, you asked about Social Security and what's happening with Social Security and what is going to be done with Social Security. And I think it is clear that what we're going to see with Social Security and Medicaid is that they are probably not going to explicitly cut it, because that would be political suicide. What they are going to do is they're going to make it extraordinarily difficult to get those services. So the cuts to all the Social Security offices, when in fact most elderly people right now go to those offices to get things straightened out, the cuts to all those offices, and I think you're going to see the same thing with Medicaid and Medicare, but certainly with Medicaid, they're just going to make it too difficult to apply. Now, if you remember, that's something that happened in Florida for unemployment insurance before the pandemic, when basically it was almost impossible to get those benefits. So they could say, well, we just don't have anybody getting those benefits. We don't have that kind of problem in Florida. In fact, the issue was that people simply couldn't get them. So my guess is that's what it's going to look like. But one of the things I'd also want to emphasize is you are seeing, once again, the gaslighting of Republicans who are saying, it's a lie that we're coming for Medicaid. We never mentioned that in the budget resolution. But a way to think about what they did do, and similarly to the SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Programs, which used to be known as food stamps, which are in the Agriculture Department. One of the things that they said we never mentioned that. Well, what they did is they told the people the committees that oversee those programs, that they had to cut a certain amount, and it's not possible to cut that amount without cutting SNAP and Medicaid. So the way to think about this, I was thinking about this the other day, is if you were working in a job and you had 4 people under you who each made, let's say, $50,000 a year, so your total outlay for your department is $200,000, and your boss came to you and said, I don't care how you do it, but you need to cut $150,000. And then went out to the cameras or went to your employees or the people working under you and said, I never mentioned you. I never mentioned she had to cut you. So that's exactly what they're doing. They're saying, we're taking all this money away from you. We don't care how you do it, but the only way to do it is to go after Medicaid and SNAP benefits. So I'm going somewhere with this, and I have a 5 o'clock meeting, so I'm rushing a little bit. So one of the other things here is, I want to emphasize that one of the things that Trump is doing with his welcoming, for example, of the Tate brothers who were under investigation in Romania and in the United Kingdom for sex trafficking and rape and something else, money laundering, maybe, I don't remember. Don't quote me on that one. The first 2 are right. Is the both the emphasis on that kind of violence, that kind of dominant violence that most of us find abhorrent, and that is designed both to sort of say we can do this, we're dominant, but it's also designed to make us afraid. And one of the things, and just kind of to break our hearts, and one of the things that they are talking about today, they're making noises about, is a pardon for Derek Chauvin, who is the man who knelt on George Floyd's neck until he died. And that's just horrific. No matter how you slice it, the idea that and it's all on video. I mean, this is an attempt both to horrify us, to make us afraid, and to change our reality. That video exists. I don't recommend that you watch it, but you could watch it. I did before I wrote about him. And it is truly, truly horrific. The idea that our leaders would be saying to us, these are the people we want to to reinstate in our society with the argument that the Justice Department was unfair is something that is designed to turn our stomachs and to make us not care anymore. So this is where I'm going with this. People have asked, who's pushing back and what can you do? And one of the reasons that I mentioned Social Security there is because what you are not seeing as much in the newspapers and in the media, including from me, because I'm trying to keep a record of what Trump is doing, there is a very powerful pushback, first of all, from Democratic attorneys general, who did start planning in February of 2024 for what would happen if Trump won the election. It says I'm still running, even though I can't see anything anymore. And so they've been very active. If you notice, every time Trump does something, they are pushing back literally within hours. They've already written these lawsuits against what they thought he would be doing either himself or through Project 2025. So they're being very active. You're also not seeing some of the stuff going on behind the scenes, and I'm not seeing all of it either, but I know there is a lot of stuff going on back there. People putting pressure on places that could make a difference. And so the reason that I mention that is because the biggest pushback that you're seeing and the most important one is us. And, really the Republicans in the Senate have failed us. Certainly the Republicans in the House of Representatives has failed us. The courts are doing all they can, but there's a number of people in the courts who are not going to be able to hold the line. The president has failed us. Some people in the media have failed us. But you know who has not failed us? Is us. And one of the things that is really important is to continue to demonstrate that what's happening in this administration does not have the support of the American people. And even people who voted for the Republicans now, the number of people who wanted Project 2025, who thought it was a good idea, 4%. I mean, we're not talking that this is 51-49. 4% of Americans wanted that. So that continuing pressure on not just Democrats, but also on Republicans at every level, even when they write you back those annoying letters saying, well, I believe in this stuff, they are listening to you and they are recognizing they're in trouble. How do I know that? Because the Republican National Committee has just urged people, the Republicans, I'm sorry, I'm not grabbing the acronym right now, have told congressional members of Congress to stop holding town halls, because what they're doing is they're creating viral moments that everybody's like, wow, this is amazing. In these red districts, people are screaming at their members of Congress. So keep that pressure up. Keep writing to people. And I would also urge you to ask your Democratic representatives or people who lost in the last election to hold the town halls that the Republicans aren't. They would be a very good group of people to rally around to say, what would you be doing here? What should we be doing? That's a really good place to be. So I would urge you to do that, but I'm going to I've got to go in 2 minutes. I've got a hard out here. So, but I'm going to suggest something else. And that's that, I'm always talking about making sure your voices are heard on social media and all the different places they are. But this thing about Derek Chauvin really upset me, because one of my best students ever, one of my favorite students, is a law enforcement officer. And this is not him at all. And he's great. And those of you who are law enforcement officers or law enforcement adjacent, whether it's with the military or the police or the National Guard or any of the many places where we have law enforcement officers, the people who are upholding the law, those are people to honor and to call out and to make sure that they understand that we're relying on them. And, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking of that particular student, but now I'm also thinking of all my other students who are in the military or in the National Guard, or people like Mike Fanone, who was a Capitol Police officer who voted for Trump, has said he voted for Trump and now is defending democracy. That's the kind of voice that we need to bring out into the open so that we don't think that all law enforcement officers are like Chauvin, because they're not. And if you know those people, that's my task item, is to call them out and to uphold them in this moment going forward, as you call on all your reserves to make sure people are protecting American democracy. Okay. I'm gonna run here, and I will try to do these more often. But like I say, I got a heart out, so I got to run. Thank you for being here. I'm sorry that was sudden notice, and I hope that was useful. And I will see you again real soon. Thanks for being here.